Hello, everyone. I am Charlotte Gaillet. I'm the president of the Association of Graduate Art Students, and I want to welcome you all to the keynote presentation of the Emerging Scholars Symposium, Visualing Identity, Exploring Dimensions of the Self Through Art, hosted in partnership by the Association of Graduate Art Students and the Georgia Museum of Art. Before the start of tonight's program, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Lamar Dodd School of Art and the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences for their financial support of our symposium. I'd also like to thank the Georgia Museum of Art and Museum Director, Dr. William Island, for providing us with the platform and space to host this weekend's events. And thank you to Dr. Isabel Wallace, the head of the graduate program at the Lamar Dodd School of Art. Thank you to my fellow symposium committee members, Francesca Felicella, Noah Dassinger, and Tara Kraft for their assistance, as well as our faculty advisor, Dr. Janice Simon, for her guidance and wisdom throughout the development of the Emerging Scholars Symposium. Many thanks to Dr. Callan Steinman, the Curator of Education, and Dr. Shania Harris, Curator of the Emma Amos exhibition that the symposium is held in conjunction with. They have been so instrumental in the logistics and organization of the event. Throughout the presentation, you can put your Q&A questions in the box at the bottom of the toolbar on your Zoom screen, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and we'll hold all questions till then. If you have Zoom or technology issues, we ask that you put those in the chat box and leave the Q&A box available for questions only. I will now hand it over to Dr. Shania Harris, the Larry D. and Brenda A. Thompson Curator of African American and African Diasporic Art at the Georgia Museum of Art. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Again, my name is Shania Harris, and I'm a curator here at the Georgia Museum of Art for African American and African Diasporic Art. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Adrienne Childs. Dr. Childs is both an art historian and a curator. Her scholarly interests revolve around the relationship between race and representation in European and American fine and decorative arts. She has held several fellowships, including ones at the Lunder Institute at Colby College Museum of Art, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts at the National Gallery of Art, the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, the Clark Art Institute, and the David C. Driskell Center at the University of Maryland. Dr. Childs has also contributed to the celebrated series, The Image of the Black in Western Art, Volume 5, published through Harvard University Press. Childs was also co-editor of the book Blacks in European Art of the Long 19th Century by Routledge Press. Her current book project, Ornamental Blackness, The Black Figure in European Decorative Arts, is forthcoming from Yale University Press. In addition to her writing, Dr. Childs is a senior consulting curator at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., and associate of the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. And just as a side note, in terms of her curating at the Phillips Collection, she recently curated the exhibition Riffs and Relations, African American Artist and the European Modernist Tradition in 2020. And an additional exhibition that she curated a few years ago was The Black Figure in the European Imaginary at the Cornell Fine Arts Museum at Rollins College in 2017. In addition to these curatorial roles, one significant one that should be noted in conjunction with Georgia Museum of Art is her curation of and contribution to the catalog for Tradition Redefined, the Larry D. and Brenda A. Thompson collection of African American art, which connected us to our patrons who donated that selection of works to our museum back in 2011. So without further ado, we will now hear from Dr. Childs in her talk, In the Vortex of Art and Identity, Black Female as Subject and Object.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and then go to become a little icon in the corner for all of you. I really miss seeing everyone in person. But first, I'd like to say that I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank Charlotte Gaillet for inviting me. It is always nice to be recognized by graduate students, arguably our toughest audience. I also want to thank Callan Steinman, and I really appreciate the lovely introduction from my friend and colleague, Shania Harris. And you reminded me of something I didn't forget about, but the fact that I curated that Larry and Brenda Thompson exhibition, Tradition Redefined, and it has become sort of the core of that collection there at the Georgia Museum of Art. Makes me very proud, and you're named for that, for them. So that's really a wonderful connection here. So the conference this weekend, titled Visualizing Identity, Exploring Dimensions of the Self Through Art, is a pertinent framework in light of this, for my talk, and in light of the wonderful exhibition, Emma Amos Color Odyssey. So I want to congratulate Shania and the museum for that success. What I thought I would do tonight is to look at identity through my journey, personal journey as an art historian, thinking globally about how this issue of identity and of the self has shaped my research, writing, and curating, filtered basically through a discussion of the image of the Black female as both object and subject. And we're going to go through several hundred years in just a few short moments, so hold on. As a scholar focused on representing Blackness in both European, American, and Black diasporan art, identity is at the very core, or perhaps the vortex, of what I have been doing. I'm using the term vortex because I think of this different magnetic fields that pull you in different directions, creating highly charged, dynamic, and a somewhat unstable environment. For me, this is an apt description of trying to document, interpret, and represent Black identity in Western art. I think it's also interesting to look at how my personal identity has inflected this process, because as a Black female graduate student, aspiring scholar, curator, writer, and writer, my personal identity has often become a factor in how my work has been received or perceived, or how I choose what to work on, or worry about what to work on, or my marketability as a professional. And I think this still comes into play. For instance, I have never had so many requests to participate, write, curate in things as I have this past year, since the murder of George Floyd and the global rise or reemergence, I guess, of the Black Lives Matter movement. Everyone is looking for Black curators to participate in ways that they never did before. So of course, I'm trying to take advantage of all of this, but on the other hand, I do have other work to do, but it's a very interesting phenomenon. So I will take you through parts of my research as well as the work of other scholars and discuss how I engage with this notion of the Black female identity and how these notions changed as I move forward with my work and move forward in time, aged, in other words, as my work migrates from Europe to America and back to Europe, and as the field itself has changed. Okay, and all right. I went back to graduate school as a mother of two, and I'm 35 years old. Don't tell anyone that. Having already received a bachelor's degree in art history and a master's in business administration. Coming to art history after being away so long was quite a shock. My undergraduate course at Georgetown was rigorous, but very conservative. I had no introduction to feminist art histories, identity politics, new methods, race and art, etc. And to be honest, it was very difficult for me to catch up and adjust with this at first. I felt, and the fact that I was older than the typical student, I thought, it turned out not really, and a stay-at-home mom may have defined my identity to others at that stage, and it certainly made me feel somewhat insecure. I think that my current career path was most influenced by a course I took on women in 18th and 19th century French art with June Hargrove, who would later become my master's and dissertation advisor. I had originally intended to focus on African-American art for my degree. I mean, this is what I was supposed to do. I worked in museums and dealt with African-American art. I had worked at the African-American Museums Association, et cetera. But of course, I was very drawn to the art and the burgeoning critical literature in 19th century studies. I was also fascinated by the number of images of Black people, particularly women, that I found in French painting. I was really intrigued by Jean-Marc Natier's Mademoiselle de Clermont at the Bath that you're looking at right now. Taking this as a subject of my first paper, I very enthusiastically went to find all of the resources, all the articles and books that would discuss who these Black figures were, what their role was, what their function was. Were they portraits? Were they actually people in her entourage or in her court? And of course, you know the rest of this story. There was nothing. I realized there was very little discussion of these Black figures. They may have been mentioned as servants or slaves, but with no acknowledgement of their different identities within the image, and certainly none about them as models. The only model mentioned in any scholarship about this particular painting is the sitter, Mademoiselle de Clermont, who was part of the royal family of Louis XV. So is this a blessing or is this a curse? On the one hand, there's an entire field of inquiry that I might be able to contribute to, but on the other hand, will I be pigeonholed as the Black woman only interested in Black identities? I thought about this as I continued on in graduate school and considered writing a thesis on this material. I told my graduate thesis advisor about it. And to be honest, I was surprised when she said she didn't even realize that I was African American. So I was like, okay, this is just too complicated. So I said, I'm just going to do what I want to do. So I wrote my master's thesis, Serving Exoticism. And what did I learn? I learned that this Mademoiselle de Clermont, the French title was that she was a sultana. So she's being pictured as a sultana. So this is supposed to be a Turkish bath, part of the French fascination with all things Turkish or Turkery. And the presence of Black servants in this painting is linked to French understandings of the racial makeup of the Turkish harem, where Black servants actually worked, according to histories and accounts of that material. So they're trying to link it to this idea. And of course, it's also linked to fantasies of the harem, 1001 Nights. Always Black figures are there. So I'm looking at literature, I'm looking at a lot of things. So in the end, their presence is all about her identity and not about theirs. They're props that draw on notions of race and sex, as well as the lure of the exotic. I also concluded that focusing on the Turkish harem and its practices of slavery diverted the very real and brutal practice of slavery in the French Caribbean. Saint-Domingue was a thriving colony wholly dependent on slave labor and a cash cow for the French. They never really dealt with that in terms of this kind of high art, fine art painting, but they did in other kinds of imagery and prints and things, but it was never really dealt with. And so I felt that those ghosts are haunting of these kinds of images. Even though there is an effort to avoid colonial contexts in much of the work, they are nonetheless present in the bodies of the Black figures that are depicted. And I think this is a frame that goes throughout this whole thing, whether you're being depicted or depicting yourself, these relationships, hold relationships continue to haunt imagery. The Black women in these images racialize the space. Often the quote unquote odalisques that are the subject of the work are based on European types. The Black attendant racializes her companion and transports the scene to the erotic East, where French audiences knew that these kinds of cloistered women's cultures flourished. And like I said before, diverted attention from the actual colonial present. They are not really, these Black women are not really connected in any qualitative way to real people, but the idea of these people. And this is a particular point here with Delacroix's Women of Algiers. We know he was allowed into the women's apartments, quote unquote apartments or harem, if you will, in Algeria to sketch them. And this was a Jewish family there. And there was no Black servant there. When he came back home to complete the painting, he added her in as what Linda Naka would later call an authenticating detail. So she's a trope that has been going on for a couple of centuries in terms of this Black attendant. So there are a lot of reasons why these Black women are there, but they are there as a concept and a construct of this notion of the East. And this was something I thought I could follow through with, so I did, and I ended up, well, the trope of the Black exotic attendant would fascinate me through my graduate career. She was seen in genre painting, history painting, and in religious themes. I finally decided to write my dissertation on this material, although I hesitated again. By this time, I knew that I was faced with the prospect of being typecast, being considered the race woman in a field of mostly all white scholars. And that is really the truth, still is. What would that be a good thing, or would that not be a good thing? I wondered if my colleagues would see this as a personal crusade as opposed to creating dispassionate scholarship. And so at one point, recently, I was being so sort of dispassionate about what I was talking about. I was questioned. Why are you so clinical? Your references to Black figures that were clearly problematic were not, I was not being passionate enough about that. So of course you can't win. So as a scholar of color, your race is taken into account in your professional life as your scholarly art and your scholarly output in ways that others have not traditionally had to deal with. Until recently, of course, when white artists and scholars are now challenged on whether or not they have the standing to speak about Black themes and issues. So we see that happening. So I was worried about all that stuff. And in the end, of course, I said, forget it. It's too complicated. I'm going to do what I want to do. And I went with this material because I loved it, found it fascinating. I found it was still lacking in the scholarship out there, and I think it has basically served me well because you all have invited me here tonight. And I missed a thing here. Okay. My work regarding this material is often about binaries. How the Black female figure operated as a signifier, how she complicated the identity of the main figure, but had no real identity of her own, truly objectified. 19th century artists like Jean-Léon Gérôme relied on obvious iconography to bring home this point, but the works were often slippery. For instance, À Vendre here is ostensibly about Gérôme's outrage at seeing the slave market still in operation in late 19th century Cairo. Now, they had prohibited the slave trade years before, but there remained an underground slave market. And it's really not so underground because Gérôme was able to see it. But so this is purportedly an abolitionist image, if you will. I emailed Gerald Ackerman, who was the foremost scholar in Gérôme when I was writing my dissertation, to ask about his many slave market images. And he literally sent me an email back and says, oh, Gérôme was an abolitionist, And I'm looking at this woman here, with the come hither look and everything, and the nudity and all of that. I'm thinking that might be a little bit more complicated than that, but this is how people have looked at these images. But he still relies on the white sexualized female and the Black primitive sidekick. He relies on contrast and skin tone. And a lot of the things that I've talked about in a lot of the scholarship. And there's a certain unknowability, if that's even a word, about these Black women who rarely gaze out at the audience and are rarely differentiated. They're just very difficult to know. We don't know about them as models, even though we're going to hopefully find out something soon about these Black models. And historically speaking, Black slave women had no voices that carried through the centuries. So I could not really draw upon historical accounts of women in Turkish harems, for instance, or women sold into slavery through the Cairo markets. It was difficult to unearth or unpack their experiences. And frankly, I doubt that the artists were really concerned with those lived experiences either. So I use these kinds of images as a way to think about their importance in the history of art as signs, albeit fairly one-dimensional signs. And maybe that's not fair. There are a lot of aspects to these works. I discuss these kinds of images as demonstrating how art supports and disseminates racial ideologies of domination, often insidiously. I suppose that in some ways I was feeling the responsibility for representing these unrepresentable women when I spoke about them in presentations, but it was often very difficult to get to their individuality. I will say that this material occupied me for quite a while, and at one point, my colleagues Susan and Libby and I tried to get our organization that we belong to, called the Association of Historians of 19th Century Art, to present our material on the images of Blacks at in their CAA affiliated society panel. And they turned us down. And so they said, well, why don't you just go ahead and get CAA to sponsor, to be in the regular, schedule. And so that we did. And then, of course, it was a success, even though they put us on at 8:30 in the morning. I'm not saying it's a racial thing, but, whatever. And then we ended up publishing the papers in a book. And we added more papers in that book. The book is still in print and it's actually gone into paperback. Susan and I went on to curate an exhibition called The Black Figure in the European Art Imaginary, based on this material. And that book it's been multiple editions of that book. And it was in the Musée d'Orsay in 2019 in their gift shop when I went there. So this was successful material that I wondered why they did not allow us to present it through the affiliated site. So there's a little barriers to break down. I still belong to the organization. I love them, but I feel like there were some things going on there that I didn't really understand. So it's always a little bit of a struggle, But in terms of notions of identity and representations of Black women in European art, things started to change as scholars dug deeper into works that represented the colonies. The works didn't change, and the works, nothing happened because the works were always there, but it's about who's looking at what and when, right, and why. So we're looking at representations of the colonies, not the fashionable themes, the metropole, the diversionary themes, like the exotic themes that we began to look, that artists like Delacroix and Jerome were looking at. Artists like Agostinho Brunias, whose work in the Caribbean had been dismissed as merely picturesque views or ethnographica, perhaps even tourist art. Now there are scholars like Mia Bagneris, who are looking at these works as really giving us some insight into colonial identities and race in a much more complicated ways than we had originally understood. This painting, Brunias's Linen Market, was in the exhibition that Susan, Libby, and I curated, called The Black Figure in the European Imaginary. It reflects a vast array of Black identities that grew up in the British colonial world. While still rather schematized, Brunias nonetheless addresses head-on generations of racial mixing, forced and unforced. This flaunting of this taboo subject was not exactly welcome news back home, I am sure. He details the stratification of Black people according to their closeness or distance from whiteness. He shows women from slave to free, dark to light, and all shades in between. Unwittingly, I'm sure, or maybe not, Brunias reveals some complex glimpses of agency on the part of Black women. They are mistresses, they are entrepreneurs, they are mothers, servants, slaves. While we still do not know who these women were, we get a sense of Black female lived experiences. In some of his work, we find evidence of subtle resistance and the assumption of social power. We also get the sense that these realities were seen, they were witnessed by someone. One of the byproducts of women whose identities were never considered, yet their images remain, is that their lives were not witnessed. So, speaking of Black female lived experiences, recent interest in uncovering the identities of some of the many important Black female models of the 19th century European art has yielded some fascinating and monumental results, right? So things are starting to change as we start looking into these women. As we begin to know more about them as individuals, we see a kind of subjectivity emerging. Denise Murrell's fantastic work on 19th and early 20th century Black female models in European art has been groundbreaking. Her recent exhibition, Posing Modernity, that was mounted at the Wallet Gallery at Columbia University in 2018, unearthed a great deal of information about Laure, Manet's Black model, in his infamous painting Olympia. Manet stated that Laure was a very beautiful negress. Of course, negress was shorthand for Black woman and would be the marker of Black female identity in France through the century, and I would say probably into the next one, really. Laure, the negress, ended up modeling for several of his paintings. And a few months before she modeled for Olympia, Manet painted this standalone portrait of her on the right. Of course, it's called La Négresse. And I don't know where the subtitle Portrait of Laure came into the picture. And as we all know, and we should know that these titles are always in flux. And they are never really fixed, and they shift with the tide of racial consciousness. So we don't know whether or not he called it Portrait of Laure, but he did identify her as Laure in his writing. So perhaps he did. Further in, so Muriel uncovered the fact that Laure lived in Manet's neighborhood. And further, in the process of looking for Laure, she discovered a viable Black presence in Paris at the time. So Muriel really brought home the fact that the Black presence in Europe at the time was part of its modernity. Much has been made of the white model of Victorine Meurent, who posed as a prostitute, and how her frank nakedness and returning gaze was the stuff of modern life. Now, Muriel has taught us that the identity of the Black attendant, although drawing on an age-old trope that we've seen over and over again, was also a testament to modernity and the experiences of Black people dispersed through colonialism. So it's interesting to think of how colonialism here is a ghostly presence, was a ghostly presence in the Natier that we looked at earlier, but is really framing this piece now that we've dug up more about the model. And it's interesting also that they're both depicting sexualized white women with Black attendants. In our exhibition, The Black Figure in the European Imaginary, we also included the painting on the right by Joanna Boyce Wells, head of a mulatto woman, Mrs. Eaton. Here's the subtitle again. I don't know when that happened. So beware, curators and what add these titles in and take them away. The woman is Fanny Eaton, who posed for the typological portrait of a mulatto woman. Eaton was a Jamaican-born mixed-race woman who lived in London and worked part-time as an artist model. She was associated with the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and she appears in many works. Often her race is effaced, and here she is creeping or peeping out right behind here. This sketch in the middle by Walter Fryer Stocks really reveals her subjectivity. So when we put the painting on the right, head of a mulatto woman, in the exhibition, we also added this Stocks, an image of that to the wall label, so people could see a little bit her as an individual. So it's interesting because we might know, I think we know a little bit too much about the pre-Raphaelite models, the white models. And if anybody studied that material, you know what I mean. We knew too much about those ladies. They were all involved with them and all that. But for the most part, I never recognized her as a Black model. I never recognized that in any of the works. I just wasn't looking for it. So for someone like me who's been looking and wondering about these elusive Black women in European art, these findings are really important. A step further on the quest for some kind of subjectivity, some kind of potential understanding of how Black identities were captured in the visual arts. I mean, sometimes you just have to look really, really hard to find them, and the material is often there. And just as a footnote, Fanny Eaton has children that are still living in London. The exhibition, the Model Noir at the Musée d'Orsay in 2019, which was related to the posing modernity, but it markedly increased it, was a treasure trove of images of Black females in French visual culture. Great efforts were made to unearth their stories. It's not until until the 20th century, I think, that we get a much better understanding of the identities of Black women who appear in European art, and therefore we can surmise a kind of persona that they might be communicating through portraiture. Of course, the mostly male artists who are depicting them remain very much in control. But there are many ways female models asserted their identities as objects of portraiture. You are looking at a well-known model, Aisha Goldblay. She was part of the Jazz Age Paris crowd that frequented dance halls where Blacks and whites mingled. There was Black music and dancers, and there were reviews or these little shows that featured Black cultural themes. And etc. I think in terms of the arts communities, there is a jazz age fetishization of Blackness going on at the time. The music, the African art, we know all about that in the modernist aesthetic, and Black people were in vogue, right? It has been called negrophilia by some. But Black culture becomes fascinating, basically. Now, whether it's really Black culture or is it constructed to meet some expectations of what Black culture was, it's different in different situations. But in this environment, it's in this environment that we find self-defined identities that begin to emerge in the visual arts. Aisha Goldblay was born in Belgium to a Flemish father and a mother from Martinique. So just like these colonial identities that were present in earlier art, but difficult to trace, they're becoming more fully developed. And, you know, she's a European woman. Aisha was painted by Matisse on the far right, Valentin in the middle, which I didn't add here, that's fine, and Mose Kissling on the far left. And as with many of Matisse's Black models, he had more than we know. They were able to unearth that material here. His penchant for non-natural skin color basically effaces her race. But on the other hand, we know her identity because the painting is called Aisha and Lore. And the Valentin in the center really captures her presence and her persona. And the painting is also called Aisha. And she was a personality in her social circle. So she would have been someone to name. A case that has recently come to light really brings into relief the vagaries around Black women, art, and identity as it is being negotiated in the modernist circles in the early 20th century. It is a case of Adrienne Fiddlin, model, dancer, and muse to American artist Man Ray during his Paris years. A footnote in the Man Ray lore, Adrienne, or Addie, as she's called, has been almost single-handedly resurrected from the dustbin of art history by Man Ray scholar Wendy Grossman. Addie was both his model and his love interest for many years. She was the first Black woman featured in a leading US fashion magazine, Harper's Bazaar, modeling Congo headdresses. And you see that layout here on the right. And I just love this quote, "The Bashongo of Africa sends his hats to Paris." I'm wondering about, you know, whether or not someone was really sending it. That's a kind of a romantic notion. And we know what was going on in the Congo during that time. But nonetheless, these are fascinating objects and fashionable at the time. And I'm kind of almost surprised that they were featured here. So I thought it was a very progressive kind of impulse to have them there, and then to have a Black model wearing them. But what is important to me here is that it has taken this long for someone to investigate and uncover this woman's story. As it turns out, her story was actually discoverable, and there is a significant paper trail. So it was something that no one bothered to do. Grossman's work is revealing to the extent to which, Grossman's work reveals the extent to which this Caribbean woman becomes part of the storied modernist circle, including Picasso's entourage. There's plenty of documentation of her presence and familiarity with this group. And this is some snapshots of them socializing in Muga in 1937. And during this time period, Picasso painted portraits of all the women there. Man Ray also took 400 photos of her throughout their liaison. So there is a lot of information, visual information about her. But it took Grossman's dogged research to identify this painting by Picasso on the left as being a portrait of Addie, based on this photo of her by Man Ray on the right. Now, this is just a recent discovery. As much obsessive work that has been done on Picasso, this episode seems to have slipped through the cracks. Most of the other paintings he did in Mugan in 1937 of the other women there, including Dora Maar, are identified, and this one is not. This is a rare portrait of a Black female by Picasso. Remember, Les Demoiselles suggests Blackness, but are they really Black? I don't think so. I don't think so. And they, and of course, they were not really drawn from models. In 1906, he didn't have a bunch of models in his little studio there. So he has obviously been interested in African art, Africanness, but has not really represented a lot of Black people until Grossman discovered this. And you see the wash bin, she's holding a wash bin on their washboard, and then you see the kind of, there's a lot of corresponding aspects of this. And so this is a very big discovery. It's a very big discovery, and I think it's important to see how that a woman like this is part of what we are thinking of as how modernism gets how Black people and individuals and their lives are inflected in these modernist work, particularly the work of Picasso here and Man Ray, but it was very difficult to kind of match up their lives with their representations, unless someone starts digging into it. So for the exhibition, Le Model Noir, that was really so keyed into the identity of the models, the museum wanted a contemporary take on the fact that they were uncovering these lost identities. So they commissioned a work from African-American artist Glenn Ligon, whose brilliant Some Black Parisians literally names the models in neon floating above the central hall of the exhibition. So here's Some Black Parisians. This Ligon is famous for his work with light. This is interesting to me because this space was once a train station, right? And I'm quite certain that some of these individuals that are named here passed through this very hall when it was a train station. So Ligon has had examples of a few of the signatures of the models. A couple of them had signed into some log books in the artist studios, but for the most part, he didn't have signatures, right? So he had artist friends of his to come and design a signature, in place of this art, these people. So you have Laure here, you have Alexandre Dumas. Of course, he's not a model, but famous writer. But Jean Duval, who's the girlfriend or whatever love interest of Baudelaire, and several other of the models, Aisha Goldblay, and then non inconnu or unknown, right? Unknown model. So the process of recovery has taken like a century, right? But here in neon lights and really channeled through the contemporary artists' signatures, these formerly unknown models and things are treated as headliners, really. So I'm skipping now over to across the pond to America, where my research has taken me, and it really was always sort of in the murky waters in between Europe and America. And I thought that, and I just want to look at how African-American artists have dealt with these issues of identity and identity politics. African-American women. And we know that particularly those who have been represented as marginalized and in a really violent way, I say violent, but very fraught way, as Black women have been represented in European and American art. Representing yourself is always filtered through how you have been represented, right? And there's a lot of intersectionality here in terms of being not just a Black person, but a female in a male-dominated society, male-dominated. But I thought I would land for just a second on Lois Mailou Jones, who went to Paris in the late 1930s to sort of bridge this gap to study and work. Her active participation and subjectivity in this School of Paris environment will begin to erode some of these barriers of power that have been so difficult for Black women to breach. She pictures herself here as an artist, like so many male artists have done before her, in front of the easel, brushes in hand, and in control. I included her work, Jeune Fille Française, here to demonstrate how Jones is really turning the tables here by depicting a white female subject. This is something we do not often see in art by African Americans. We still don't see it that often. So I thought it was kind of interesting to see. And of course, Jones goes and does a lot of French subjects and landscapes and cityscapes and learning sort of the modernist in the way that many artists who went to Paris at that time learned and depicted scenes of Paris through vis-a-vis some of the modernist icons that they studied, like Cézanne and Monet, etc. But I think she's an important transition figure in this. And so African-American artists will continue to grow, expand their voices throughout the 20th century. I have chosen to look at a few artists as we consider how they have forged identity through the visual arts. And I'm, circumscribing this in some ways along some of the work I've done. We are fast forwarding now to look at Black female artist self-representation, their assertions of subjectivity through the visual. In 2009, I published a book on the printmaker Margot Humphrey. I can safely say that nearly her entire body of work is autobiographical. She tells the story of her life, her interests, her family, her ups and downs through her expressive, idiosyncratic prints. In The History of Her Life Written Across Her Face, Humphrey tells the story of love, loss, motherhood, and coming back from despair via text and symbol. She is very honest and frank about her life experiences. She grew up in Oakland, and of course, I contextualized her in the feminist movement, which was born in Oakland in some ways, while writing this book. And she actually pushed back and said unequivocally that she was not a feminist. And she did not like those women. So we have to be very careful about that. But for me, as a scholar and knowing where she was starting to work in Oakland in the 70s and 60s, I couldn't not contextualize her, put her in the larger framework of feminism, but particularly the notion of personal being political. So I did it in the book, but I did say that she does not claim a feminism. So it's kind of a really interesting thing about identity. She did not want to be associated with the women. And then finally one day she told me, well, I did go to a few meetings, but I just didn't like them. So it was a very personal reaction. But I think that the medium of photography has been a site where Black female artists have explored self-representation and identity with great sensitivity and conceptual acumen over the past 30 years. Of course, the first artist that comes to mind is Carrie Mae Williams, whose foray into Black female subjectivities with an S, is both intimate and universal. Through the camera lens, Williams often uses her own body to explore her life, her personal concerns as an artist, and a woman, as well as exploring cultural narratives of importance to Blacks in the diaspora. But she uses her body as the index, the fulcrum. In the Kitchen Table series, she chronicles the comings and goings of a family at the charged site of the kitchen table. In her Louisiana project, she is the witness to the fraught history of the Southern plantation. And I think it's interesting how Williams always leaves space for the viewer to enter to her world. We feel like we're sitting there at the table with them. Now I'm going to go real quick so I can get to my exhibition. Afro-Cuban artist Maria Magdalena Campos Pons explores her history and the history of Black Cuba through photography. Again, she mines issues of identity that are fashioned in exile. Memory and family are constant concerns in this work. Here she is negotiating an identity that takes into account the physical manifestation and the memory of her Cuban homeland. They are literally written on her body, like with Margot Humphrey written on her face, this is written on her body. On the left, it reads, identity could be a tragedy. On the right, in Spanish, patria una trampa. Homeland is a trap. Trampa. Homeland is a trap. Homeland, a trap. I think that's the translation. So I'm just going through a few photographers who use their bodies, use themselves, and California artist Genevieve Gagnard explores the vagaries of Black identity through the photographic self-portrait. A mixed race woman, she experienced a sense of invisibility growing up. Certainly her Blackness was difficult to read, but she investigates notions of passing and the anxieties that arise from these kinds of intersectional identities. And her work is really, really interesting if you don't know it. And she looks at a lot of, she goes through a lot of 1950s and 60s styles, hairdos, and these personas that she achieves through self-portraiture and different wigs and costumes. She looks at glamour, she looks at class, and always this underbelly of race, and as a Black woman who doesn't always read as a Black woman. And I just threw these in here because I wanted to go over. I wanted to, and these are not photographs, but I wanted to bring in something that I think of as the mythic self-portrait, right? Not an actual, with actual verisimilitude, but portraits of the uber Black woman. Bitter Crop by Alison Saar is reclining nude, whose hair provides a root system for cotton, her blood red body nourishing it all. So there's something about these that are representing Black females in a larger sense. These mythic bodies are all of us, like Simone Lee's sculpture with no facial markings that presents a state of being for Black women. These cultural bodies speak to Black womanhood across time and space. And the anonymity of Lee's sculptures make room for multiplicities of identities. So I want to end with just a brief discussion of my curating in this vortex of art and identity. Just a touch, I talked about this Black figure in the European imaginary. I was so thrilled to be able to borrow the painting, the Moorish Bath, on which I wrote my dissertation. So I felt very excited to do that. And it turned out to be a really nice exhibition. Yes, I could say more, but I'm going to go on to my most recent exhibition, Riffs and Relations, at the Phillips Collection, that looks at how African-American artists have engaged European modernism from many different vantage points. And we had 15 female artists in the show. 15 female artists, and I did not even realize it until after the show was up and I started thinking about different ways to think about the work, that 8 of these images by the 15 female artists were self-portraits. And then these Black women are using their bodies in myriad ways. And the one that's most relevant to what's happening there in Georgia now is our Amos piece, Malcolm X Morley, Matisse and Me. And one of the things that I wanted to do with this exhibition was to bring in the work by the African-American artists and have the works by the European artists with whom they engaged, upon who they riffed or whatever. Not everyone has a matchup, but this one did. And I was so thrilled to be able to show both of these pieces in the gallery together. And you see here, Amos has quoted Matisse in the blue nude and the large seated nude after she saw the big Matisse show at MoMA in 1992. So here's the gallery in which they were exhibited together. And one of the things that I was thinking about was we wanted to make sure that the major pieces like this Matisse, that they don't overtake or outshine, take up all the room and space in the room with the other African-American artists. And I think we achieved that, but it was great to be able to see this in this line of sight. And one of the things about this self-portrait that Amos does with this piece, we don't know which one of these images is actually her self-portrait. Is she this blue nude, or is she the reclining nude? And how is she positioning herself? In some of the other pieces where she takes a swipe at European artists, is very clear what she's doing. But here it's a little ambiguous. And so we thought, but I still think it's a great way of looking at the source and looking at Matisse and his interest in African art and all of that. And one of the other things that happened in the show, which was a surprise, was how well the Matisse piece was in dialogue with the Elizabeth Catlett Ife reclining nude in there. So in order to sort of almost not to sort of build a strength around African-American practice here in this room, it was great to be able to have Matisse being answered by not only Emma Amos, but by Elizabeth Catlett. And the identities here, I mean, these are some of the Black female artists who were, whose self-portraits were integral to their work. Ioni B Jackson is a younger artist whose all of her photographs feature her. She's the main character. Well, she actually plays other characters, but she's the body in all of them. And this obviously is how these works represent artists who are riffing on Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, which is the most riffable painting, I think, ever, because a lot of artists respond to it. And then, of course, Renee Cox, whose Cousins at Pussy Pond, is one of the early riffs on Manet as far as Black women artists are concerned. And of course, they're taking back this idea of the gaze, and they're owning it as artists and as models. And filtering their own identity. And then, you know, Cox is a little play on the idea of sort of the African body, and then modernism always filters in to it as well. Last but not least, we have Makita Hahuja, whose work was done, who painted this for the exhibition. And she is looking at responding to Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is being addressed in this painting, within the painting behind her. And her personal story is very front and center here, because she had a very hard time conceiving and having a sustainable pregnancy. And at this time point, she was very much pregnant with, and she's showing her sonogram here. So she's thinking about Picasso's Demoiselle and sexual violence, and she's thinking about tragedy and her own personal difficulties in having a child, and her own identity as a female artist, right? So all of these women are thinking about themselves as artists and subjects at the same time. But Makita does a whole series when she's pregnant like this. Anyway, happy news, she did have the baby, and brought the baby to the opening, and everything was very good. But it's interesting how she's thinking about sorrow. Back in here, she's looking at Picasso's Weeping Woman. So a lot of of course, the works in the exhibition are targeting, not all in a bad way. Some of them are very much nurtured by these modernist artists, but others are questioning the power that they've wielded throughout the years, and they're constructing themselves through this dialogue with the past. And then here's Ellen Gallagher's Odalisque, where this is a famous photograph in Matisse's studio, he and his model, but she has removed Matisse's head and put Freud and put her own face on the model's face. And she's cutting him a look like, are you kidding me? Or like, brother, please. So again, going back into time and trying to assert some kind of resistance to this passive decorative woman that Matisse was always famous for doing. But on the same hand, loving everyone. You know, Matisse is one of these artists you love to hate, you hate to love, but really appreciating some of his artwork. Most of the artists do appreciate Matisse, but again, Gallagher is very much interested in the beautiful, see the gold foil flowers around, but she's also intervening in this process. And of course, intervening in this sort of psychological process of the genius artist, the genius Freud, the genius Matisse, being able to define female sexualities. And so that is it. I've taken up too much time, but I want to thank you for asking me, and I will stop the share.
Thank you, Dr. Childs, for that fascinating talk about your walk with the scholarship in Black female identity. At this time, we will have a little bit of time for question and answers. So if anybody in the audience has a question, you can put it or type it into that question and answer box, and we can get Dr. Childs to respond. Okay, so our first question says, can you talk more about your experience as a Black curator?
Yes, experience. Well, it's interesting. I didn't say this, but I was the first Black curator that the Phillips Collection ever had in their 100-year history doing this show. I came to them through the with the help of Wendy Grossman to propose it, and not thinking about that, but that ended up being kind of something that was important to me and important to my community, and at a larger institution like that. And so I think it's also important to the museum. And that says something about, though, that how long it's taken for Black curatorial voices. As a curator, I mostly worked with the David C. Driskell Center. I worked there for 5 years, and then I went on to do some independent projects. And I think I've been very lucky. I think as a Black curator, but I've never been, aside from working at the Driskell Center, which was quote unquote part-time, but it ended up being a lot more than that, but it was a wonderful job. I have not been hired or as a full-time curator at an institution, or nor have I really tried to do that. I've always I valued my independence. So I don't have the same kind of experiences that other people who have been curators at institutions for long periods of time have been. I've been able to come in, do the show, and then get out. So maybe I can't answer that, but I do feel like it's interesting that I have a degree in European art, and but most of all my exhibitions have helped to deal with race and representation, African American, even the European art. And so I think it would be a bold thing for someone to hire me to curate a European art show. That is the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about not pigeonholing people or getting real new voices in. So
yes, and kind of going off that question, we have another question that says, what's the biggest change or shift you've witnessed in the curatorial field from when you started out? And what's that change you'd like to see in the immediate future?
Well, yeah, I think that there's a lot more interest in diverse voices, et cetera. Like I said, I cannot tell, I get a request every single day to do something. And you have to wonder sometimes whether or not it's a sort of a huge knee-jerk reaction to something that they don't know, because there's a reckoning going on in museums now. But it's necessary to look at yourself, the museums to look at themselves to see what they've been doing, what they haven't been doing. So I feel the changes have been coming over the last few years, and there was a big exponential push last year. But just hiring someone who's Black is not not the way, not the end, right? Or Black or Asian or whatever, it's not the end, it's the beginning. It's about getting people on your board. It's about thinking about things a little bit differently. But there was a time when I wouldn't, like I said, I told the story about not getting the association, not letting us do our little panel. And it ended up being a really important piece of work. But there was just, sometimes it was just, I think, a backlash against the politics of race in that kind of thing. So, and now there's more like, oh, we have to reconsider this again.
So the next question says, hi, Dr. Childs, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I was hoping you could speak a bit to the primitivism movement of the early 20th century. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in your assessment and perspective, especially in curating work by current Black female artists, on how this movement affected the perception of Black bodies and identities.
Yeah, well, we talked about that a lot in Riffs and Relations, because there were many of the contemporary artists, even what I showed Makita Hahuja, talked about the problematics around primitivism. And what is primitivism? And sort of the interest in African and other kinds of oceanic and quote unquote primitive art in the early 20th century, probably, spurred on by Picasso and his followers and other German expressionists. And they felt like the fact that it's built on objects that are coming through this colonial world that might be bloodstained. There's objects that are sort of representative of a kind of exploitation. Was understood, I think, a lot more after the 1980s, after the primitivism show at MoMA. I think that was a big moment when artists started saying, whoa, wait a minute. And they started paying more attention to what was all about. And since the 80s, we've seen a lot of backlash, and a lot of Black women artists respond to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a lot of, and they respond to the sort of silence of female bodies in modernist art, not just Black female bodies, and the lack of Black female voices, certainly in European art. And of course, it's all going out of my head, the names of these artists. And they're looking at the mask that was used in many ways in the early 20th century, and then how to turn that around and try to find some subjectivity in those objects. Emma Amos responded to Man Ray's photo Noir et Blanche and her Yo Man Ray Yo. I don't know if that's in the show. So there's been a lot of real, it's an important thing for Black artists to look at this, because African-American art has grown up with modernism. It's basically a modernist project. We're talking about the early 20th century. The artists were very much engaged with modernism, very much engaged with the notion that African art is their cultural patrimony. And so they kind of borrow some of the aesthetics from the Europeans and the idea of using African art, but trying to make it their own, So it's kind of been a fraught thing.
And this next question says, thank you so much for your wonderful talk, Dr. Childs. I especially enjoyed the way you folded in your own personal story into the presentation. In your opinion, how important is it for historians of color or historians of difference to fold their own subjectivity into their work, especially when conservative disciplines such as art history encourage invoking a ethereal mastery through self-effacement?
Oh. That's interesting. Yeah, I realized when I started curating, and then particularly when I curated Riffs and Relations recently, because I got some of the press for conservative people were not really, most of the press was fantastic, and there were a couple of really weird interactions. But these kinds of curating something is an artistic process in itself, and even writing an article. Writing a dissertation, it's your art, it could be anything. It could be so many different things. This exhibition, Riffs and Relations, could have been just as successful and had none of the same art in it, and had a completely, because it's being curated and put together by someone else. It is a creative process. It is my voice, right? And so, or our voice, if I'm curating with someone else. And it doesn't exist outside of you. And so it is a personal reflection. That article you write doesn't exist outside of you. And if someone says, well, you should have written about that. Well, no, you write about that. I'm going to write about this. So, I mean, it is your work, but you do have to have this kind of objectivity. You have to hit the right notes and say what everyone else has said before until you get to your point at the end. I'm tired of that. That's why this time I just said what I wanted to say and made it all about me. But no, and I also think it's nice to be able to see someone who's doing this for a long time give you the underbelly of it, because it's all of us are insecure. All of us wonder about how we're representing the stuff and how we're representing ourselves. So I think it's always a personal reflection. But if you do your homework and you can cross those T's and dot the I's, and then don't be afraid to use your voice, because it can't be anything else. And don't let anybody make you think it's something else. And you might read something that's written a long time ago and think, what was that person thinking? They were doing what they wanted to do. I mean, they were thinking what they thought. So you have the voice to do that yourself. And it's a personal reflection.
This next question says, did you ever study the notion of creolization through your research or work as a curator? If yes, in what way?
The notion of creolization. Yes, I thought about it, but it's interesting. What would that would have been for work, probably not by European artists about Africans or Black people, because they're kind of giving it through their European lens, doing it. But it would probably be more a creolization about art and objects made by people who have been in this creolized world. And so I'm trying to think of, and I don't think I've done a lot of work in that area. No.
Okay. This next question says, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. You talked about Black models supporting the white sexualized, exoticized models in the pictures of, for example, the 18th or 19th century exotic French paintings. I wonder if the Ottoman Turkish or other non-Northern European models were perhaps also racialized, and if so, in how far that was different or similar to the subjects models you analyzed.
Okay, can you read the?
Yes, they're asking, I wonder if the Ottoman Turkish or other non-Northern European models were perhaps also racialized, and if so, how far was that different or similar to the subjects or models you analyzed?
Yeah, sometimes they were racialized. Yeah, absolutely. When you're talking about by European artists, a lot of times they were basically still white models, European models that were racialized through the presence of other Black attendants or the carpets in the room or the architecture, sort of exotic settings. And it was often like an excuse basically because they were still kind of puritanical in some ways, particularly the British, in terms of the nude model had to be either an allegory or some kind of exotic from somewhere else. But there were some artists who tried to get at what the actual Turkish woman might look like, right? And so yes, there were, but there's always a big contrast between the attendant and the model and the central figure. But I don't think they get a good job of that. But as time goes on, when artists start to travel, see, artists weren't traveling to Morocco like they were at the end of the century or the later part of the century. The early part of the century, they were armchair travelers for the most part. But once they start traveling there, it becomes very different, and they start to really look at the ethnic sort of particularities of women, particularly in Egypt. That you can't get into a Turkish bath. You can't, no, people wanted to say they were in there, you can't get in there. You can't get into the seraglio. They're not letting you in. So you're making it all up. But they were finding a lot. And so you could find models and stuff in Cairo to fulfill that. So they were much better at that by then.
All right, this next question is interested in the archival problems you've run into when identifying Black models in European paintings. So what issues have you had identifying archival sources, and what strategies have led you to success?
Well, I hoped to make sure it was clear that the people that were looking into the models were Denise Murrell or Wendy Grossman. I have not looked into the models. So, because when I was doing this in the 19th century, I got my degree in 2005. No, yes, 2005. I chose to go the iconography way, right? I chose to look at, because I just didn't know where to start. I also did some research on some sculpture by Cordier. And there are models mentioned. A model came into my studio and he was beautiful Negro, or he was from Senegal, blah, 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 or Sennar, something like that. Anyway, so we were able to dig up some materials, but without really going deep into those archives, I decided I just couldn't do that. And that's and Denise Murrell picked up that in her dissertation and really looked at those identities. I was doing more of the Black woman as a symbol, but when the Black models start coming up, and we start learning more about them, then we realize we really can go back and look at where to look. And those are like in studios, like say you have the artist studio, they might have a lot of notes and studio journals in which they write down who came through and who was the model. And then once you can connect a name with that and go on and on, but it's another avenue of research altogether.
All right, and then we have one last question that says, could you speak more on relationship between self-representation, particularly representations of the body, and autobiographical practices in the work of post-1945 Black women artists? Do you see the historical foundation for these practices primarily in the women's movement? And how do you see this practice developing into the 1990s and the present?
Oh, that sounds like another talk. Let me see what I can say quickly. Post-1945, Black women artists, self-representation, self-portraiture, using their own body. Well, I'll start by saying this, as looking at my exhibition, saying that half of the women, more than half of the images were self-portraits. None of the men were self-portraits. And then again, I was not looking for that or charting that, but I just happened to go back and look. So I do think it comes out of a feminist practice, using your own body. There's just no question about it, because I feel like artists, women who are artists, want to claim their role as an artist, right, as well as their role as to create, to use themselves and their experiences to convey that art. But women artists were so far behind, really, that in order to assert their identity as an artist, they use themselves, or else use doppelgangers of themselves. Like even Faith Ringgold, in a lot of her work, she created an alter ego, and she was the character in the work, but it was about her. So I do believe it was coming out of this notion of women's work, women's identities being so tightly wound up in their artistry, and them being the sources of the stories to tell. And what was the second part of that question?
Yes, the last part was, how do you see this practice developing into the 1990s and into the present?
Well, I see, you see Carrie Mae Williams' work. I think she was some of that starting in the 1990s. I can't even remember. I think it is stronger and stronger and stronger. And you see that Genevieve Gagnard is just one. If you even look on Instagram, I'm curating on Instagram now. The self-portrait now for men too, much more, and the photographic self-portrait is it's almost like a trend. It's almost to the point where it's becoming something that is done so much, it's losing its power in some ways for me. And I don't know if I should say that out loud, so you didn't hear it. But it is, and we're talking about diasporic practice. But yes, I think it's becoming stronger and stronger, and also taking on different identities, and also exhibiting yourself and different personas is very important in this work as well. And I haven't thought about it a lot. And one of the things that made me start thinking about it was after I discovered all these self-portraits in the exhibition, and I didn't write about it and I didn't even see it until I went into the room and saw all these artists staring back at me. And I think it's a way for them to bring themselves into the discussion, and rather than being, totally objectified, they're behind and in front of the canvas, behind the canvas, behind the camera, in front of the camera, everywhere. And you cannot escape their authorship.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming and presenting for us, and especially in relation to so many of us as grad students working on dissertations and our theses. And I just want to remind everybody that the graduate presentations will be taking place tomorrow from 12:30 to 3:30, and on Saturday from 12:30 to 3:30. And thank you so much for joining us for this keynote presentation.
Well, I thank you, and I hope you guys, enjoyed it. Thank you.